Hello, I'm Leanna Renee Hieber. I'm going to be reading one of my short stories entitled Not More Lovely Than Full of Glee, which is featured in A Winter's Tale, Horror Stories for the Yuletide. And in Not More Lovely Than Full of Glee, it is a sequel to Edgar Allan Poe's The Oval Portrait. In The Oval Portrait, an artist quite literally paints his young bride to death. This is my sequel. Not More Lovely Than Full of Glee. It was said that the artist had abandoned the fine house in the mountains, that richly appointed chateau with a turret where countless rooms stood silent, adorned with art and colored glass. Rumor had it that the cellar was an open pit, and the upstairs floorboards creaked and thumped. It was said that he'd left the village haunted after the untimely death of his young bride, but then again, the peasants below were full of superstition. It wasn't that anyone had seen her, but the disappearance of her lovely Glee was a haunt in reverse. The absence of a once beautiful treasure was the living's own ghost to bear. She was talked about. Her memory had life, and in it, she was again not more lovely than full of glee, as the very mention of her made the elders smile. Then they'd cluck their tongues and ask the rhetorical question of what happened to her. They knew in their hearts. Out, out, brief candle. She'd been snuffed. It was Christmas time, Christmas Eve to be specific, when the artist made his way back to the sorrowful site in hopes that the season of peace and forgiveness could create an alchemical change in his heart and his fortunes. What better time to reckon with the past and turn a new page, a heart made pure as the mountainside under a fresh blanket of undriven snow. When the artist's driver reached the end of the lane, the old man hesitated. "Go on, sir," the artist assured. "I'll walk from here. Turn around, get that shivering mare into a warm stable. I'll be all right." He unleashed his leather case from the back of the carriage. "I'm home again, and I have to make my peace with that." The hunched driver crossed himself and turned his hack sharply, murmuring a benediction for the artist's soul and something about her that became lost in a gust of wind. The chateau loomed ahead at the end of the tree-lined lane, its form like a skull on the edge of a cliff. The last of the day's light glinted off eye-like windows, and the land below was ushered swiftly away in a sheer drop. With a crunching tread through deepening drifts, the artist made his way forward. He glanced up at a noisy blackbird grumbling in a treetop, noting that the branches arching above him had begun to gnarl and knot, claws in a tangle. A warning from the morning halted him at the property's wrought iron gate, which yawned open at the latch. He recalled the woman in the train bench in front of him when he handed his ticket over to the conductor and said what town he'd be stopping in. She turned around, mourning veil nearly obscuring her wrinkled face. "Take care there, my son. Yuletide or no, it is a place of curious endings." These words had chilled him enough to make him reconsider his return. He had opted not to go through the town and up the rugged pass, but instead continue on the rail north and take the higher road privately back. He was sure if he'd paraded through the central pass, there would be whispers and cruelties spoken not enough out of earshot. His sorrow was heavy enough without gossip weighing it further. Stepping up the overgrown flagstones to the hefty carved oak front door, the artist noted the glass on either side was broken, the lock forced. He shouldn't have been surprised that brigands took evident shelter here, assuming the place was abandoned. They hadn't been wrong. After the funeral, the once romantic nest had become as silent as the lily-marked grave down below. The artist didn't dare look down the side of the mountain at that valley churchyard. The only comfort he could muster was what he hoped still lay ahead, hung on the walls inside: his art. Once inside the foyer, he struck a match to light the front braziers and then struggled with the resistant wick of an oil lantern. Lamp finally lit, by jaundiced light, he began his tour of plaster walls lined with paintings and dark wooden roof beams decked with spiderwebs. The colored glass lining the windows was as dark as the night sky, but his art remained safe within. He sighed in relief. In the main hall were his vast landscapes, ruins, abbeys, castles. Up the curving stairs were the faces, patrons, scholars, nobles. They were works of great renown, each a captured flash of fervor and obsession. Now, here, they were his witnesses. He hadn't stopped painting during his time away. He did have to eat to survive, and there were no other skills to which he was suited. But looking at these pictures here, remembering them again, feeling them in his fingers as if he were still sculpting the paint onto just the right texture, nothing he'd painted of late had the life of these earlier works. And nothing, of course, had the life of her. Perhaps that's why all the art had been left alone, deemed haunted. There were footprints tracked in the dust ahead of him as he climbed the curving stone stair, the lamplight illuminating a limited arc ahead of him. 2 pairs of feet, then just one as the furthest chamber was reached. He paused at the open door. The prints of the boots were hardly fresh, so it had been some time since the trespass. And as the steps were few, the place must have been denounced as eerie enough to ward off subsequent intruders. At the end of the hallway stood the turret room that had held his most precious treasures, his best work. The place where he captured her adoring look, forever, to the last. The night was a dark one, and very little light came through the lancet windows ahead. If the artist wasn't mistaken, even the lamplight hesitated at the threshold, as if it didn't dare disrupt the deep shadows within. Trembling, he took a deep breath and stepped into the chamber. The bed curtains across the room were open, and the bound book that had chronicled all the artistic works within the house lay open to a final page atop the rumpled bedclothes. His mind swam. Had a friend, the week she died, offered to add in one final entry? The artist didn't remember and was too unnerved to look. Instead, he bent to set the lantern upon the floor, cast the book aside, and lay down upon the dusty bed, folding in upon himself to weep. It wasn't that he hadn't mourned then. It was that he'd gone into a detached state and felt like he was only now waking up, jarred to the truth of the empty place, her vacancy. He had been so obsessed with the look of her and how to translate it, he hadn't considered the reality of her. It is a place of curious endings. She had ended here. And yet, what was art but a chance at eternal life? He tried to bring the image of her to mind, of her beautiful face, even as she was laid out in her winding sheets. But all he could see was the flurry of brush strokes in his mind's eye. All he could seem to recall was the drag of horsehair on the palette and the angle of the dim light. He had tried so desperately to capture what was always said of her, glee above loveliness. The final result was, of course, stunning, unearthly, but it had been cast aside when the health of his model, his wife, vanished. "Forgive me," he whispered to the empty room. Bare trees scraped against the narrow windows like the scratch of fingernails. The portrait was there on the wall behind a curtain. After the funeral, the artist had placed it in the deepest of shadows. All he had to do was lift the lamp, draw the shade, and confront his fated masterpiece. Face down on his coat sleeve, he steeled himself and wiped his streaming eyes on his cuff. That's when he heard a footstep. A light footstep. From the corner of the room. A slow, pervasive paralysis crept over him. Another step. The creak of a floorboard. He did not dare lift his head now. Another step at the head of the bed. Shifting his face, unable to help himself, he peered between his fingers. The curtain over his wife's oval portrait was drawn aside. The frame was empty. A sound left his throat, something strangled and shocked. The shadows to the side of him, mere feet from him, moved. In a scramble, he reached for his lantern, lifting it up with a choking, "Who's there?" There she stood. Shaking, the artist lowered the lantern, but its arc was wide enough to capture her whole form at the head of the bed, dressed in the dark gown she'd been painted in. My God. There was a glow about her like a phantom, and yet her small, slippered feet were planted upon the ground, as much solid as shade. Her face looked just as he painted her, but the curve of her smile was terrifying. Then the figure spoke. Her voice was soft, musical, glancing off the artist's ear as if from across the hall. not right before him. "Hello, husband." She smiled an obedient, sharp-toothed smile. "How do I look?" He gaped at her. She took another light step forward, coming around the bed towards his cowering form. Her feet sounded on the boards, and yet no dust was disturbed in her wake. "Am I not more lovely than full of glee?" she asked. "Is that not what always was said? It is important to remember what has been said." He fell to his knees, crossing himself. A miracle, though how can it be that you are here now? I buried you, my sweetheart." She drew close. Cold hands that abrased like dry canvas shot out to cup his cheeks. "You did, my husband," she murmured hungrily. Her dark eyes flickered to the wall. "But my life was here all along. You saw to that. Down to the last spark of my body's vitality that you gave to the glint in my painted eye. Did you not think there may be more than one way to take and give a life?" Still in her unsettling hold, he tilted his head to the side, not understanding her question. She did the same in an eerie mirror. "The storytelling," she explained, "the tales told of me. I suppose you wouldn't have thought of it. Your art was in paint. Your mind in lines and strokes, I understand, but you're here now to see the power of the word. It giveth and taketh away." His wild fervor was held by her sharp fingernails. Her smile broadened, gleeful indeed, as she bent to kiss him. He shuddered in her grasp. His color leapt from his cheek to hers. A spark leapt up. That ineffable, glittering light, that unfathomable mystery. She caught the luminous wisp in a deep breath, rolled it on her parched tongue, and swallowed it whole. The artist slid to the floor, motionless. The book that chronicled the entire gallery of the chateau, indeed, works of great renown, stood open to the very page that told of her demise, her sacrifice. That the book was open proved it had been read. Someone had come to bear witness to her tale, but it was as yet unfinished. She plucked a pen from the prone artist's pocket and added to the narrative, which had ended abruptly with her death. She continued the tale. Yes, dead she may have been, but what has the finest wit of our age said? Life imitates art far more than art imitates life. Perhaps, but it must also then be said, death imitates art far more than art imitates death. If art captures life, then I was never wholly dead, and words have resurrected me. I have stepped out of the frame to begin anew. Church bells tolled the midnight mass to proclaim a special child was born to a peasant, urging the world to tell tales of sacrifice and eternal life. She stepped out of the turret, strong footfalls treading the sonorous floorboards. She kept walking until she reached the town below, where tales of her reached further still, not more cautionary than full of fear. Thank you. That was Not More Lovely Than Full of Glee, as appearing in A Winter's Tale, Horror Stories of the Yuletide. My name is Leanna Renee Hieber, and happy Halloween.